Hey there, Chahawi Hills. I want to welcome you yet again to another Bible Fellowship video, and we continue working our way through our series on emotions and really understanding how to handle them and the role that they play in our lives and what the Word of God says about them. And so today we're on a very interesting one. It's the idea or the topic of anger. That's something that's very familiar to all of us. We probably don't like to think of ourselves as angry people as a whole. But there are certainly times in every one of our lives where anger overtakes us. Our circumstances turn or go sour. Sometimes it's a big thing, maybe an ongoing struggle that we finally just blow our top over, or maybe it's a little thing that sets us off. We're all different, but I would say we could probably be in agreement that there is no person on earth that has never experienced anger. It's, again, like all the other emotions we've talked about, it's a very real deal. And so, again, sometimes the things that anger us are valid and genuine. Sometimes the things that anger us are silly things that we should just be able to better dismiss. But regardless of those things, the reality is anger is a part of our lives. And as Christians, we really should ask ourselves, how do I respond to things? Now, we could chase a lot of rabbits in this lesson and talk about justifiable anger, or righteous anger, and those sorts of things. And while those certainly have their place in this discussion, this is more of an idea of us dealing with anger that comes up in our lives from an emotional level, and how do we respond and how should we respond. And we've got really a great example in Psalm 35 of King David. And we don't necessarily think of King David as an angry person, but he wrote in his Psalms from a point of passion, and he wrote many times from his own personal experiences. And so when he was on a spiritual high with the Lord, he would write a certain way in the Psalms. When he was in a spiritual low, or in this case in Psalm 35, we really believe that this psalm was written during the time when King Saul was chasing David, really with the intent of killing him. So that wasn't necessarily a spiritual struggle, but it was a circumstance in his life that he found himself in. And so all of those things can bring to bear the way that David writes, and it gives us an insight into his soul, and it gives us an insight into the things that God spoke to him in those situations. So we can learn a great deal from it. So, looking at Psalm 35, I want to start with the first three verses. And it says this. This is David writing, "Oppose my opponents, Lord. Fight those who fight me. Take your shields, large and small, and come to my aid. Draw the spear and javelin against my pursuers, and assure me," David's asking him, "assure me this," and he puts it in quotes, "I am your deliverance." David is really asking God to give him that peace of mind, or that sense that he is really in control. We've been seeing that in a lot of these discussions about emotions, that God is sovereign and that God is in control. And this is yet another example where we see that this person who's experiencing something in life is really coming before God with these petitions and pleas. And obviously the language is written in such a way that talks of the time. And he's using them sort of in an analogy, but when he's talking about shields coming to his aid, drawing a spear and javelin against his pursuers, he's talking about the warfare that he knew and that the times would have experienced. And he's using those in that metaphorical sense. God doesn't need a shield, God doesn't need a javelin or a sword, but in military terms, in fighting terms, he's asking God to be the one that wages battle on his behalf. And so, just, the background of the story, I'm sure, but if you don't, King Saul was the one that had been appointed king, and he didn't, he liked David, but he knew that something was coming. Saul had even said that David was going to be the next king, that Samuel had told Saul that his reign wouldn't be forever, that it would come to an end. And so even when David defeated Goliath, the crowds started to really support David. And remember, they said Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his tens of thousands. And so that began to develop this a wedge of animosity and even, dare we say, hatred. Saul really had it in for David, not so much because of what David did, but because he saw David as a threat to his kingship and to his leadership. And so that sets the stage for what's going on here. As you know, if you've traveled with us to Israel, no doubt you've been to the mountainside, the caves, the hills of En Gedi, where the scriptures tell us that David went and hid in caves as you know he and his men were running from Saul and his men. It's a fascinating thing to go visit and bring that story to life. And so it's in this time that David feels pursued and chased after, and so naturally there can be this sense of anger, especially when we consider the fact that David didn't do a whole lot to bring this on himself. This is an idea of circumstances that came around him. Another person had it out for him, and so he could have very easily been filled with anger and rage about the unjust situation going on. And yet here's what he says. He basically brings a plea before the Lord. This is what we refer to as an imprecatory psalm. And it simply means it's one of those psalms where the writer or the author is asking God to bring harm and disaster on someone else. And really that tends to fly in the face of what Jesus preached about turning the other cheek and about and not being a violent person and so forth. But that's, unless we think that David was mean-spirited here, we need to remember a couple things about David's story. The first thing that we would point out, if you remember that in 1 Samuel 24, there was an account where in one of those caves, David and his men were hiding, and Saul went into one of those caves, and the scriptures are pretty clear. He went in to use the restroom, and while he was in there, David could have actually taken Saul's life. David could have fixed the problem on his own. David could have let his anger overtake him. He could have said, why is this king chasing me? David could have said, I know I'm going to be the king anyways. Let's just speed this process up. And yet he was still faithful and obedient. So he cut the corner off of Saul's garment, if you remember, off of his robe, and used that as evidence to say, look, I could have killed you, but I am faithful to you. So he really took the high road, we might want to say, in that particular situation. So even though he had that easy opportunity to kill David, and that actually happened a couple of different times, where he had the opportunity to kill Saul, and he chose not to. And so we kind of get the idea of David's intent and his spirit when he's writing these things. But the second thing is, even more importantly, that is in this verse we see that again he really does take this matter to God, and that's really lesson number one in dealing with these anger issues. Resisting the temptation to fix the problem ourselves, but also understanding that we must bring our anger, our feelings, the entire set of circumstances, we must bring them before the Lord. And so again, David didn't seek vengeance, but he called out for God to deal with the problem. And if you look further into that psalm, it's not in our lesson, but if you look through Psalm 35, David is calling on God to humiliate Saul or to bring disgrace upon him. He's there's a very raw emotion there, and again, David's not some angel playing on a harp. I mean, he's a human being, and he's facing the situation, and you can almost see that he's processing these feelings of anger, and he's debating: do I let this anger overtake me, or do I just step back and breathe and say, God, here's what I wish you would do, but ultimately I know that you're going to handle this situation. And so even in Deuteronomy 32, we read the idea of vengeance and justice being God's and not ours. And so ultimately David resorts to that. He processes through these potentially harmful feelings of anger and decides, I need to give this over to the Lord. So if we look a little bit further in Psalm 33 up through verses 13 through 16, the story expands a little bit. And he says this: Yet when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled myself with fasting, and my prayer was genuine. I went about mourning as if for a friend or brother. I was bowed down with grief like one mourning for a mother. But when I stumbled, they gathered in glee. They gathered against me. Assailants I did not know tore at me and did not stop. With godless mockery, they gnashed their teeth at me. And so really what that is in reference to is we understand the tension between David and Saul, that Saul really wanted to see David's life come to an end and that threat stopped. But it was also the idea of Saul's soldiers, his warriors, the other people that Saul had brought against David. So it wasn't just a one-on-one, it was a many-on-one. And so if you think about it, David's referring to these people when he's talking about when I was sick, and when he said I was in mourning, and when I stumbled. Those are not references to him being physically sick or him making mistakes, but the idea that he was now the outcast from the group. Remember, these were no doubt men that he had fought alongside, maybe men that he in the past had prayed together with before they went out to battle. And now, because of Saul's anger and hatred towards David, he finds himself being opposed by these very same men that used to be friends, these very same men that used to be soldiers together, brothers in arms, side by side. You can maybe even dramatize that a little bit and imagine a battle scene where David may have thrust a spear through an enemy and literally saved the life of a fellow soldier. And now here we are down the road, that fellow soldier coming against David, seeking to take his life. And so that really puts this into perspective, because it draws again that picture of, did David have the right to be angered by this? Well, yes. From a human perspective, he sees, not only does Saul want me, but everything in my life changed. All the people that used to be supporters of mine are now coming against me. And so he talks about this idea, this heavy sense of mourning, as though a person had lost a mother. He talks about not only did my former friends, look at again in verse 15, assailants I did not know tore at me and did not stop. So not even the people that he knew, but they got other people to come against him. And so this is building and building against David. And you might say, as you read that story, well, I would be angry too. Yes, again, is it wrong to feel anger? No, that's every one of us does. But it's how we respond to that. And that's what we really need to see with David. That was a weird situation there. David's best friend, Jonathan, was Saul's son. And there had been these deep connections. David had been a mighty leader in the military for Saul, and now all of that turned on its head, and David was the one being pursued. And so it really is a time when friends or family or those that were closest to us, when they turn on us, boy, that's a time when we just want to say, that just makes me so mad. And we feel justified in that, and we say, it really wasn't my fault. Well, just on a side note, many times there are situations in our lives that come against us and they're not our fault. But there are a lot of times when we use that as an excuse. I didn't do anything. This wasn't my fault. And if we really were honest with ourselves and went back and looked at everything in a big perspective, we probably did have something to do with that. Maybe we planted a seed. Maybe we made a silly choice that expanded. But I would say, for as many times as we might say, I'm not to blame here, there's probably just as many times, if not more, where if we really look at it, we had a role in it. And so we need to be very careful about how we respond to anger. And that's really what this is all about. So in Psalm 35, skipping to verses 17 and 18, the final thought here is David writing these words, Lord, how long will you look on? Rescue me from the ravages. Rescue my precious life from the young lions. I will praise you in the great assembly. I will exalt you among many people. And again, it's interesting. It's a final note there that, Saul took his anger and his hatred of David to the battlefield and to physically chasing after David with the desire to conquer him. David fights back not by wielding the sword, but by coming before the Lord in these prayers and petitions. And it's interesting in verse 17, he says, Lord, how long will you look on? And I wonder how many times we think that when we've got things coming against us. Because even in that one statement, what he's basically saying is, God, I know you're observing, I know you're watching, but how long are you, in his heart he's saying, how long are you just going to sit there and watch this take place? I'm begging and praying and pleading with you. How long are you just going to sit in the chair and do nothing before you respond on my behalf? Again, that human element of maybe even a tinge of anger of David towards God. He knows that he can respond. He knows that he will respond, but then it becomes a matter of God's timing, doesn't it? It becomes a matter of, God, I know you can do this. Are you just going to sit there all day, or are you going to act on my behalf? So even the very honest and just raw emotion that David is writing with needs to be sensed and grasped here. And he says again that this plea to be rescued from their ravages. He views his life as precious, not from an egotistical standpoint, but that he values what he has to do, what he has to live for. He also knows he's been anointed as the king. He's anointed as the future king. He knows that God has his purpose and plan, and so in that regard, it's a precious life. And again, the picture of the ravages, the young lions, and so there wasn't a threat of lions, but it was again that picturesque way of saying, I really am in trouble. An example we might say is, boy, I feel like I'm on a sinking ship. Well, you might say that here in the middle of the mountains, and there's no ship or ocean around us, but we understand the metaphor that's used. We understand the word picture when we say the ship is sinking. Now, it's the same thing. I rescue from my precious life from the young lions. He wasn't literally being attacked by lions. It was a way of saying, it's coming at me from all sides. I'm being ganged up against, and I'm being attacked. And he really is just pleading with the Lord. How long are you going to sit and observe? But he does understand that if God doesn't intervene, his life is going to be in trouble. And he's doing that in a sense very purposefully. Could David have fought against Saul? I believe he could have. I don't think that would have been the wisest choice, but I think he could have. He was a man of war. He was very familiar with battle. I don't know that he had enough men to conquer all of Saul's army, but he certainly, again, had those opportunities to kill the king. He could have fought back in certain ways, and yet even with all of that at his disposal, he understood it's far better for me to respond to all of this situation openly and vulnerably before the Lord, but ultimately doing what God wants me to do. How can I honor God in this? And so David had every right, in our terminology, to be angry, and yet all of his frustrations he poured out before God, not before Saul, not before mankind. He opened himself up and just poured himself out before the Lord, even to the point of being vulnerable and exposing himself. And you might as well do that because God knows everything anyways. And so instead of letting that anger well up in him and do what he probably could have done and fight back, he was just passionate and open before God, but ultimately understood that God was going to be the judge. God was going to take care of things, and it would be done in God's timing. Now, if we look back in the history, in the story here, we understood that it did happen. Ultimately, I mean, if you read these fascinating stories, Saul and his sons were put to death, and Saul was thrust through with a spear in the battlefield, and he asked his armor bearer to finish him off, and the guy refused, and so Saul fell on his sword, and you understand the whole story there. And so justice did come about for Saul, and just as Samuel had prophesied, because God had given him the prophecy, David was placed in the position of the king, all in God's timing. And so the feeling of, Lord, how long will you look on, is a fair question, but the answer to that question is not always going to be God saying 10 more minutes. Sometimes the answer to that question is wait and trust. Just trust me. That's what God is telling us. And ultimately, David settles on that in verse 18. He said, I will praise you in the great assembly, and I will exalt you among many people. And certainly, he did that as king. He did that in his writings. We're studying his writings even now. So it's very important to understand that he took his anger to God and left those issues in God's hand. It's just a great reminder for us as we look around, especially in a year like we've had, where we say there's so many things going on around me that I could potentially be angry about. And maybe we have things, just the normal things in life and relationships and circumstances and finances and all of those things. And then you heap on what we've had this year with this virus. And we weren't dealing with that last year at this time, but now there might be that idea that you're so angry and I wish this wasn't here. And maybe you've lost someone, or maybe you've had some ill effects from this virus, or maybe you're just so angry about having to hear about it all the time. That we weren't dealing with that last year. As can often happen in our country, we've had an election year. Maybe that's caused some anger on your part. You don't like the way this happened, or you wish this whole process would be done differently. Whatever those cases are, that's what happens. We have the normal circumstances in life, and then we have other things that tend to crop up. But we need to understand all of that is going to be dealt with in God's timing. We go to Him and say, God, would you deal with my pursuers? Would you deal with my attackers? Forfeiting the opportunity to take those matters into our own hands and letting God deal with those things. What happens when you're angry and you deal with those things in your own hands? You take those matters in your own hands. Sometimes it's little things like you just literally blow your top. You don't take a deep breath and ask God to walk you through a situation. You just react and blow your top. And then when that happens, you've embarrassed yourself, you've driven a wedge in a relationship, perhaps. There's a lot of negative consequence to that, when it would be far better to let God deal with those situations. And so us taking matters into our own hands will never solve the problem in the long term. Usually it's us just feeling better about ourselves and helping us deal with the anger in our own way, and that's never a great situation. And so let's really understand more and more what it's like to hand over those things and circumstances to the Lord and let Him deal with those things, and see if our life isn't more a life of peace and more a life of contentment and more a life of learning how to trust in the Lord in all things. And so again, a good Christmas encouragement and good things to think about as we roll over from one year into the next. Well, it is going to be Christmas. I'm not sure if you're going to watch this video before or after, but either way, let me say Merry Christmas to you and your family from me and mine. And I'm looking forward to 2021. We've learned a lot this year, and what we have come to understand is that despite the circumstances, God is on His throne. We celebrate the birth of the Messiah this Christmas season. None of that has changed. If anything, the world has shown us that the need for the Messiah is even greater. Not that it's ever been less, not needed as much, but our awareness of how much we need to tell people about the message of salvation. Life is short. Times are tough. Things are challenging around us. Jesus is the answer to our situations and our circumstances. And so then if we can at least take the idea of anger and put that off to the side, we may have opportunities to tell people about the true meaning of Christmas. And so I do hope that you have a blessed, safe, and healthy and happy holiday season. And we look forward to seeing you very shortly here on campus or online. We did just send an email out. You probably have already received it, but due to the large number of cases and under the suggested guidance of the governor of our state and Dr. Randy Davis, who's the executive director of the Tennessee Baptist Mission Board, churches are being asked to slow down a little bit. And so for the next couple of weeks, we are going to honor that, and we'll be online December 27th and on January 3rd. Again, we will continue to reevaluate that situation as we move forward, and hopefully as we move a little bit further down the line, we'll see some of these things begin to settle down. So for the next couple of Sundays, we really encourage you, don't check out, get online, Facebook, YouTube, click on the church website. If you can't watch them live, make sure you carve out some time to come back later in the week and watch those services together. Watch them with your family and engage with us. And as we always do, when you're watching online, make sure you get on one of those chat forums or the ways that you can leave a message and just let people know you're there, and just say hey to people and engage with one another as we worship during this incredibly important season. Don't be angry. Speaking of anger, don't be angry that we have to be online for a couple of weeks. Give it to God. Let Him work His way through these situations. We can't take matters into our own hands anyways. And so let's trust in Him and let's exalt Him in the end, and He will be honored and blessed. So have a wonderful Christmas. We look forward to seeing you soon. God bless.